Hi, it's Amelia here from Undercover Architect. In this interview, I chat to Luc Plowman. So Luc Plowman has a business called Detail Green. He is a Passive House certified consultant and a Passive House certified building certifier. So in this interview, we talk about his role on the Alwood's Passive House project and how he worked alongside the architect to ensure that the house met Passive House requirements, and also how he generally works in this role and in his building certification role to help homeowners build passive house homes. He's got some fantastic insight into how the PHPP or the modelling tool works for Passive House, and some key things to understand about Passive House if you're planning on building or remodelling this way. I hope you enjoy the interview. Well, Luc, thank you so much for joining me on the Get It Right podcast. It's fantastic to be able to speak to you. You've got actually a really interesting role when it comes to the Alwood's Passive House and generally in what you do in your working life. And I think you're going to provide some great information and advice to the UA community, because what I'm sensing as we start learning more and more about Passive House is what a sophisticated system it is in predictively determining exactly how the house will be used, what the energy loads are going to be, and being able to set up a design and a built solution that really deals and responds to that, to be able to then moderate internal temperature and really help that break between inside and outside, so that you can really control your indoor environment. So I'm really excited to be talking to you, because I think there's going to be some fantastic insights that will come from our chat. Can you tell me, I'm asking everybody this because I think it's really interesting to hear people's different definitions of it, but what do you, when somebody says to you, what's Passive House, what's your response?
Yeah, I guess you do get asked that question a lot. Usually it's like, oh, what's the difference from a standard house to a passive house? And I guess it's a building done right. It's more thoroughly analysed. Thermal bridges are taken into account. It's a low energy building that's pretty much guaranteed to be thermally comfortable year round, regardless of the weather. I guess that's a brief snapshot of a passive house.
Fantastic. And what's your role been and continues to be on the Alwood's Passive House? Because David mentioned to me we're a couple of months away. They're predicting that construction will be completed the end of January. Yep. So,
yes.
So what's your role been in that project?
Yeah, so on this project, I'm working as what we call the Certified Passive House Designer. So in this role, I'm working with Talina Edwards, the architect, and helping her make sure her design can meet all of the Passive House benchmarks. So that's, I guess, the ESD consultant, the building physicist role, I guess, running the Passive House modelling tool, which is called the PHPP, and then feeding that information back to Talina during the design. So we sort of analysed the design and made sure that it could be a passive house, because originally it wasn't designed to be, and it was sort of passive house got added in at the end, which is fine. So we managed to just get it there over the benchmarks. Done a bunch of analysis, fed that back to Talina's documentation, and then during construction, working with Stuart, if an issue comes up or a detail, he can't build it the way it was originally drawn, making sure that all everything is still meets all the relevant requirements in terms of thermal bridging and internal surface temperatures, so that he can continue on with the construction. And then at the end of the job, when it's done, I'll be working with Claire Parry, the building certifier on this project, making sure that she has all the relevant documentation to issue the Passive House certification documents. So yeah, it's kind of a role from the start all the way through construction to the finish of the project.
Yeah, because David, the owner or the client, described that it didn't start out as a passive house. It started out as a sustainable house, and Talina's definitely learnt. Obviously, she's then pursued her certification in passive house whilst she's been working on this project. So, but I found it really interesting, because I think that a lot of people would just assume that if they're going about designing a passive house, it has to kind of look a certain way and be limited by a bunch of constraints. And when you look at this design, it's this beautiful pavilion-style home that, is obviously being set up to work for David and Yvonne's demands of what they want from being able to live in it. And David described that there was this iterative process between, himself and Talina, and then you, as changes would be made, modelling would be done, and there'd be these tweaks and changes to be able to then get the modelling to work. And, I found that a really interesting process, because I would think that a lot of homeowners would think that it's kind of just a design check kind of run through, whereas this sounds so collaborative, and the testing and the checking along the way. Is that, in your role in detail, in your business Detail Green, is this the kind of role that you normally perform, or do you do other things? How do you normally work? Because I understand, as we said in the introduction, you're one of currently two certified certifiers in the country.
Yes.
So how do you normally work in detail grade?
Yes, we do a bunch of, I guess, in a passive house building, we can do either the certified passive house designer role, which I'm doing for this particular project, or a building certifier, and you can't do both. So yeah, look, Passive House in the last 4 years has become probably 75% of our work now, which is great. And I guess touching on your earlier point there, that there's a really big difference between the NatHERS system, which is, the building code compliance, which is done as that sort of check at the end, and yep, you made your 6 stars, away you go, versus Passive House, where an integrated design is really critical right from the start. And I guess, overseas, where the climate is a lot colder or hotter, yes, you must have that passive house consultant involved from the start. And in any commercial building, you would really need to do that. But here in Australia, our climate's pretty mild, really, even though a lot of us Victorians think it's a cold part of the world. It's not. We were lucky in this project that we could get, without changing the floor plan, which has a very high surface to floor area ratio, we were able to get it over the line it's right on the upper limit of the heating benchmark. But so the climate works to our favour. And, I guess, and I think Talina's learnt too, that if we started again, the building would have a more compact form. So, yes, some passive houses, and particularly European ones, all look quite similar because of it's really critical to be able to build it cost effectively, to have a really compact building form. Whereas us here in Australia, we can do these lovely big pavilion-style single-storey buildings, and we can still have passive house, so we're lucky. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And so what does it actually mean to be a certified passive house consultant? What's required in terms of, from your background and transitioning into what you do now, what's it meant for you, and, sort of why you've taken it on?
Yeah, I guess it's, everybody has a passive house journey, and I guess mine started with I was working for a big engineering consultancy in sustainability and green buildings, but in the commercial space mainly. And I had a colleague who came from the UK, and he started talking about the passive house standard and how you get heat a house with a hairdryer. And I thought, wow. That's pretty amazing.
For a UK person to say that, definitely.
Yeah, it is. But theoretically, it's true. So Passive House was really just getting started in Australia then, and Claire and David, who started APFA, arranged for a training course here, and I was in that first locally run training course in Australia.
That's the Australian Passive House Association.
Yeah.
Yep.
So prior to that, a few people like Claire went to New Zealand to do her training. A couple of people went to Ireland to do it. So I was in that first course, and then once you get the passive house bug, there's no going back. Once you realise it's a better way to design and build buildings, you're kind of in. And so that was really, it was good to get in at the early stages, I guess. And the passive house consultant course is about 2 weeks full time. A lot of building physics, and the course is really designed at making sure you understand the principles behind passive house. And they throw in a really hard exam at the end just to round it off. So I guess it's well suited to technically minded architects or to engineers, which is my background. I guess we've moved into passive house, and once you're passionate about it and start talking to potential clients, you convince a few and then a few more, and then it's really, in the last 12 months, it's really taken off. And we're just being swamped, which is a fantastic way to be. So, it's great.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, isn't it? Particularly if it's work that you love doing and you're incredibly passionate about. I'm finding, as I said before we jumped on the interview, that every time I meet a professional who's working in the passive house arena, and this has been overseas as well, incredibly passionate about it being a better solution for homes in general. So I think it's lovely to see it becoming sort of penetrating the Australian market more, and there being this infrastructure now of professionals who are gaining training and getting themselves skilled up in being able to help homeowners in this way. So, and it is that one of those things, I think, as it becomes more part of the conversation, and people understand that it's not just a piecemeal approach. This is something that's also becoming very evident. It's a whole building system that needs to be thought about comprehensively and cohesively in how the building gets put together. I think that the benefits will definitely start to become apparent to people in terms of it being a really good choice for them. So,
I think once we get a few more completed projects, so we're at about a dozen or 14 or 15. I've got another 5 or 6 that are nearly finished, and a few more Passivhaus open days. And it's interesting to see, we've got a number of new clients who actually been to an open day and said, yeah, this is what I want. And those passionate people who have finished passive houses and allow them to be opened up and people to come in every year is amazing. That I think people nearly have to see it to believe it, because they say, oh, it's a mild climate, we don't need this super insulation, but you actually go inside one and say, oh wow, actually this is really amazing. So that's, I think, I think the growth is only going to accelerate from here.
Yeah, well, David was mentioning that there was something like 140 odd people that came to the construction site of their home on Sustainable House Day. So it is clear that there's this growing interest, and I think it's like you say, a lot of the times it requires a lot of generosity on the parts of the early adopters to be able to share this information with the general public, so that it can be seen not as this mysterious, expensive, out of reach thing, but it's actually just an alternative way of doing something, so that pays dividends in the long run. So can I ask you, Daniel was on the podcast, and he was very clear about the fact Passive House is not a trademark. It's not something that, is locked down, but there's obviously a benefit for using a trained and certified professional. I mean, is a passive house not really a passive house until it's certified, through the Passive House system? What's your thoughts on that in terms of how homeowners need to have some certainty, I suppose, about how they're going about doing this for their projects?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And the Passive House Institute do allow a building to be listed on their database as a passive house, uncertified, but as long as it has what we call the PHPP, so the Passive House model completed, and shows that it does meet the benchmarks. I guess certification is a quality assurance process. As I said before, I can't be the Passive House certifier and the Passive House designer in one. It has to be separate. So it's a real quality assurance role, and I guess it provides, we find clients this comfort that they know they're going to get what they ask for. And that's really the big selling point of certification. Quality assurance, it's not a big additional cost, but I guess the rules are very strict. And so a certified building, really a certified passive house, you can't really market your building as a passive house unless it has a certificate. But there is some very generous flexibility really from the Passive House Institute to allow people who have sort of done the work but not gone through a certification to at least show their building is built to Passive House principles. So it can be considered a little grey, and I think for most people, particularly in the early days for us, where there aren't that many trained people, having a trained professional does make sure that you'll get the result that you're looking for, because it is a big leap in technical input compared to a standard design process. The value is definitely there, and the risk of not using professional and ending up with an airtight building that's not ventilated, or a wall system that has moisture problems, can lead to significant issues down the track. So certainly recommended that somebody use a qualified professional to help you, whether that's your architect or a separate consultant like myself. I think the value is definitely there.
And just in terms of that modelling, this question's a bit sort of out of field, but when I was chatting to Daniel about the modelling and how the modelling works, it's obviously a piece of computer software that you're plugging detail and information into and data into for it to output your benchmarks and your measurements. How much resolution do you have to have in the design in order to get meaningful information out of that modelling tool? Like we had an energy efficiency rater earlier on the podcast in this season, and she explained that it can be done quite as sort of from a conceptual point of view, because you can, I suppose, assume and predict some of that information. How do you find, working alongside a designer or working as a designer in that process to do that work and give the client some direction and some confidence along the way, so that you're not, you're able to get that information early and keep growing it? That process of working in the software, and just how much time's involved, and I'm picturing this really kind of complex where you're punching in a whole heap of and sitting there with a ruler over drawings and all this kind of stuff.
Plenty of that.
What does that actually look like, and what kind of resolution do you need?
I guess there's two questions there. The first one is when do you do the first analysis, and always from a concept design, really, as long as you've got, you need the less design info, the more assumptions you need to make. So the starting point, quite often we would do before someone, if they have to submit a DA or a planning application, we would do a preliminary assessment there, particularly with overlooking issues and window sizes, shading, overshadowing issues. So our process typically is from completion of concept design, we'll do a first cut model, make a bunch of assumptions and work out what insulation and what we need to do to get the building to the Passivhaus benchmark. And then that then gets refined as the design progresses. So I guess the initial assessment is really critical in terms of understanding the form of the building and perhaps tweaking the building form before any planning applications go in. And then, refine it from there. So sometimes we get approached, I've got someone comes to me with their drawings, can I make this a passive house? That's a painful way to do it because either the building is inefficient or we need more insulation or we have to say, oh, sorry, you're going to have to change the design or go back and get a new planning permit because you need more windows on the north or something like that. So it's best to be involved early. Really from that sort of planning level application is when we would start doing some analysis.
And
in terms of...
Yeah, sorry, keep going. No, you keep going.
Okay, so the second bit was the modelling and the computer. The PHPP is really interesting. It's not a black box. It's actually based on Microsoft Excel. The PHI developed it in the early 90s, so it's 25 years of Excel. It's amazing. It's got about 30 different spreadsheets. They all connect together. It doesn't have any graphics like the lovely, like you get out of Revit or some of the other software. So it's a bit data entry-ish. It's a bit nerdish. There's a lot of, you do have to measure elements and stick them in. There's a really fantastic SketchUp plugin that the PHI have developed. So you can take a SketchUp model and it has an automatic export into the PHPP, which is good. That saves a bit of time once you get used to using it. And like any computer model, the more you use it, the quicker it becomes. So, 3 or 4 years ago, for a simple house, it would take me a whole day to do a first cut PHPP model. Now it takes me about 3 or 4 hours. So like anything, the more you use it, the easier it becomes.
Gotcha. Geez, Excel always terrifies me because if you just delete one cell accidentally, it stuff up the whole system. So
this is pretty good. It's pretty good. It's Excel used to its optimum, I guess.
And are you plugging in things like assumptions about the external colours and insulation, values and those types of things? Like, is that, I mean, similar to how NATAS works and the other energy rating systems?
Yes, but a lot more detailed.
Yep.
So different rules for measuring things. But yes, everything of the thermal envelope is entered into the PHPP. Stuff that happens inside is less relevant. So all the thermal envelope is entered. And then thermal bridges are calculated separately, and indifferent to NatHERS, window frames and glass are entered separately, and how the window is integrated into the wall system, how the roof is built up is modelled differently. So there's a lot of work, and each element of the building, how it's shaded, each window, how each individual window is shaded is modelled. So it gives you a lot more detail in, a lot more detail out.
Yeah.
So and that gives some useful Excel charts which show you where the heating load, where you're losing heat, where you're gaining heat, heat loads for individual windows, ventilation. You can play around with air tightness. So a lot more advanced than NatHERS. It's similar to a dynamic virtual environment type software, but it's a steady state model.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very powerful. And one of the great things about the Passivhaus Institute is they don't sit on just produce the software and put it out there to the market. They're constantly checking it, updating it, and they do a number of academic studies where they've taken completed buildings and measured their performance and then checked it against the PHPP, and it's very, very accurate. So we're pretty confident that the results we get are really accurate, and the buildings completed to date in Australia are showing that it's just as accurate in the Southern Hemisphere as it is in Europe. So
great. I mean, I think that's fantastic as a homeowner to have, as we were saying, that level of certainty at the design stage that you're committing to something that's actually going to deliver what the, sort of the indoor air environment and the thermal qualities that you're investing in it, doing that. So I think, are you finding, you mentioned that when homeowners, you've convinced a few homeowners, that type of thing, you finding, I can imagine with you and Claire being the only two certifiers that you would be sought after. And so in terms of how homeowners do arrive at you, are you finding that you're having to do a lot of education, or are you finding that they've already upskilled themselves significantly? I mean, it was clear that David had certainly learnt a lot along the way and had been very great, been fantastic at understanding the principles and the application and those types of things as a client. So how are you seeing homeowners arrive at you and the journey that they're going on as they commit to Passivhaus?
Yeah, it's a really interesting mix. Most people, yes, have definitely upskilled, and I think there's, with internet and Instagram and projects being built, there's so much information out there that yes, most people who come direct understand what a passive house is, the basic principles. These days I don't have to sell passive house to anyone. They come to me and say, can you help me with the passive house? I guess we've got a few regular clients where I'm working as the building certifier, some really passionate architects like Talina and a few others who really push passive house on their clients. So they've done all the legwork, and either I'm working as the consultant to help them with their design, or taking a project that a team has put together and certify, being the quality assurance role of the certifier. So certainly residential, it's all being driven by, I guess, from the bottom up, from individuals who have educated themselves. The commercial industry is a bit different, and it's being driven by passionate organisations or individuals in organisations, such as Monash University is a really good example of some of their big projects going on. I see it a bit like Green Star back in the early 2000s. It's once we get a few more commercial passive house buildings built, it's going to really take off, because everyone will say, I want one of those. I want to work in a building like that, just like they did with the first Green Star building. So, it's changing. And definitely, yes, a lot of people come to us as a building certifier. They know that you've got a lot of experience, and if they're unsure about their project or they want to be comfortable, they've got the right team. Yes, we get plenty of people saying, I want you because you're also a building certifier. So, yeah, we're busy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just I'm thinking of the building certifiers who might be listening to this podcast going, I might need to go and do a course.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the certification side of things is not the exciting side. The bit where the interest is in building the models and being the consultant like I am with the Our Woods project. That's the interesting side, and it has a bit more input. The certification role is really checking somebody else's work, and it's not as exciting, but it's a really worthwhile thing. So I guess Claire and I, originally thought we were dealing with certifiers overseas, and it just didn't add any value to the process, and it was hard to they didn't understand how we built things over here. They didn't understand the climate. So that's why both of us sort of individually decided to go and do the certifiers course a couple of years ago. And I think now we both feel like we can certainly add value to people's project and be local and understand, give them a result, help them through the process in a way that's sort of local and I guess the right outcome.
Yeah, and I think that point about it being local and us, in Australia having different climate sort of climate situation compared to the European situations where passive house began in Germany, and it's been used a lot in those European climates where you have very extreme conditions. One of the big misconceptions, I think, is, do I really need to go to this effort? Is it really necessary for me to do this? It seems really extreme. I don't want an airtight house. I want to be able to open my windows and let the breezes through. We've spoken on a couple of the podcasts. Daniel actually joked that there was an alarm that went off in head office somewhere when somebody opened a window. And David said the same thing. He said he was concerned that it was going to be something that he'd have to modify his behaviour in the house. And I think that is one of the big misconceptions is just I'm going to have to completely change my behaviour as an occupant, and do I really need this much effort and resolution to get a house that works? What do you tell people about how passive house can work in a mild climate, and in places like Australia and other places around the world?
Yeah, I think I guess the first thing with my building certifier's hat on, there's a clause in the building certification that says all occupied rooms must have an operable window. So the idea of fixed windows is not true, and it is a requirement. And you see a lot of Europeans actually with their passive houses in summer turn their ventilation system off and open their windows and use that, and then only run the ventilation system when it's cold. I guess for us, we have peak summer where it's hot and peak winter when it's colder. So we have but plenty of mild time of the year. So no, you don't have to change your behaviour. I guess you must have openable windows, but the ventilation system keeps the air fresh, so the air is never stale inside the house. So I guess that, the openable windows thing is, no, you must have an open window, but also you can choose to open them or not. If you do have them open and ventilation running in the middle of winter, that's fine. You'll use a little bit more energy, but the house will still be comfortable. And then I guess for in our relatively mild climate, do I have to go to that effort? I guess it's not that much effort here. The big leap for us is in air tightness. The average house, I think CSIRO test said, was about 15 air changes when pressurized. The passive house is, world's best practice at 0.6 air changes. That's a big leap. That's a really big leap.
15 to 0.6. That's insane.
Yeah. So that's the issue that some of the builders, when they first try, are really nervous about. But when you talk to Stuart, you'll find that he's done 4 or 5 now. He smashes it, as he says, no problems. He's not concerned about it at all. And then I guess the effort is really in, detailing out thermal bridges and things like that, which add to radiant cold or radiant heat. So to get a comfortable, the extra you pay or the extra effort that goes in, make sure that you have a comfortable envelope and there's no cold spots, there's no mold risk, there's no condensation on the inside of the windows in winter. All these kind of things that either lead to risk of mold growth or an uncomfortable, thermally uncomfortable interior. So, it's a little bit of effort up front, but the result is a vast improvement. Our climate is mild, but if you orient the building as you would in a passive solar design, there's not that much more effort to get to passive house. Some, but not massively. A bit more in the Alwards project, I guess, because of it didn't start as a passive house, but it's still being built for David's budget, so it's fantastic.
And that air changes thing, is that measured when you talk about air changes? Is that something that gets measured per hour or per day? Like, what's that quantity that you're talking about?
Yeah, so a passive house must be tested to what we call a blower door test or air pressurization test, and there's a standard to which that is done. And it is done, you close up all the windows and doors, you put the blower door, which is like a giant fan, in a door, and you turn it on and you measure the amount of air it can push into the building or suck out of the building. And that's where the air changes. So that 0.6 air changes is the passive house requirement. For you test your house, when I tested my house, I got 8 air changes. But there was no air tightness designed into my house. So I guess it's a kind of meaningless number. 0.6 air changes at 50 pascals pressure difference doesn't really mean much. But I guess in terms of building physics and how the building performs, it does make a big difference between a non-sealed house and a properly sealed up house. And then I guess the other thing that goes with that is if you do have an airtight house, you must ventilate it. Otherwise, all our breath and our cooking and our showers will make mold grow inside the house, and that's not what we want.
Yeah, so I think the big thing here is that there's this level of control over your indoor environment because you're managing the amount of air movement in and out through your ventilation system and through your air tightness. And then that means also that you're managing the pollutants that come in and out of the home as well.
Yep.
And that comment about, walking into the houses and them feeling different, would come because of that different quality of the indoor air. I think that it's one of those things. I mean, I talk a lot about designing for orientation and how important that is, and I think that that's one of those things that until you've lived in a house that's designed for orientation, you actually don't understand how much a difference it makes to your quality of life. And I think this is the same. It's like you say, is when we get more of these homes on the ground and we get more demonstration. David actually said we need to check in with him in 12 months' time to see how he's managed to survive a summer and a winter, and that the house has actually performed as he planned. He said his neighbours have questioned whether he's going to be warm enough in winter, and he joked that he'll be hanging around at their house if he's not. So, but I think to be able to see that evidence over time, it's one thing that you can model it in a software system, but to get that on the ground experience, I think will be really fantastic. So for anybody who is thinking about going about creating either a new or a renovated passive house, what would be your tips for getting started and being able to make steps in the right direction for them?
I guess good at, getting a good team or an architect or building designer on board who understands the basics of, as you've just said, solar orientation, getting the orientation of the building right for a new building. And for renovation, working out, where you can get some solar, get some sun access in from. So, a passive house follows the same principles of passive design: orientation, ventilation, shading. Thermal mass is less relevant. But yeah, making sure you either buy a piece of land which has good solar access, or renovating your house, looking for where you can get sun in. That's the first bit, and it makes it easier. If you have the house facing the right way, we need less insulation, less high performance windows to meet the passive house benchmarks. And then, having a good designer is critical. And we see lots of work from a range of builders and owner builders and architects and building designers. And spending the money on a good architect, I think, makes a big difference to the result, as long as they understand the principles of passive design. So a good team, and then a passive house consultant or a builder involved who understands principles is really useful to get started. Yeah, and it's a journey. It's a journey. That's the other thing that people need to know. It's not tick that box and it's done. It's a journey.
What do you mean by that?
You can't just do it overnight, and everyone needs to be involved from the start, and we'll be involved all the way to the finish. I guess people don't come and go. The architect can't just give you some tender drawings and say, see you later. And the builder can't just make it up as he goes. He has to follow the drawings. And the passive house consultant needs to be with you all the way to make sure that the design's right and then that the construction is correct as well. So, you can't do it in 6 weeks. And, it's a bit of a journey. Yeah.
Do you find there's an early resistance to that? Because I can imagine then there's fees associated with having all of those different team members involved from the word go. And a lot of people do, when they renovate or build their homes, they kind of silo all of the activities. They get the design done and then they move on to the drawings and they move to the builder, and they're the go-between in all of those phases, which I don't recommend, but it is how a lot of people kind of build and renovate. How do you find that conversation happening with people early, saying, well, you're going to have your designer, you're going to need your consultant, you're going to need, all of these different people involved to actually know that you're getting what you're paying for? Is that do they just go, okay, well, that's going to be that's the process I expected, or what's sort of the conversation around that?
Yeah, look, most people who are interested in passive house and done a bit of research are all for it, because they kind of want that quality assurance. They want the guaranteed outcome. So no problems. And really, when you think of it, consultants' fees are very small compared to the money they're about to spend on the house. So, a couple of % extra for a passive house consultant, in addition to your architectural fees, is not very much. So, no, generally minimal resistance. It would only be a client who you had to really push over the line, and then you probably don't want them as a client anyway. So, minimal resistance, and I think even they feel more assured having a team involved from the start, rather than going, oh, what do I do here? I've got some drawings, but I've kind of been given this advice, but now I have to translate it to the builder. Whereas having a consultant involved can sort of help with that, translating architecture into construction and making sure it can actually be built. Yeah.
Well, I always tell the UA community that the key to a successful project is having the right team around you. And when you're doing this for the first time, you shouldn't know everything you need to know, and that it's really important that you get experts to fill that expertise gap, who can collaborate and coordinate and really guide and support you on that process. So you mentioned briefly too that the thermal mass isn't as important as it is in passive solar design. Why is that not as important?
I guess this is where air tightness comes in, and removal of thermal bridges. So a really airtight building, you don't get the temperature fluctuation because you don't have drafts. You don't have cold air seeping in around the windows and under the doors. So the internal temperature stays stable, and thermal mass really works for you where you have a big temperature fluctuation day to night, or summer to winter. So we're finding certainly you can build a lightweight passive house building, and then in the PHPP we can make it a massive building by changing a few buttons, and the difference is minimal. Depending on how people want to build a building, you can use mass, it's fine, but generally lightweight construction is a bit cheaper. So thermal mass, once you introduce air tightness and removal of thermal bridges, thermal mass is less relevant. But it can be really nice. Rammed earth and stuff is something that people really love to see in their buildings, and it adds benefit, but it's not as necessary as in a traditional non-airtight passive solar design.
Gotcha. Luc, you have just provided so much insight and information on this topic, so thank you so much for your time. It's been great to be able to speak to you and share your wisdom with the UA community. I really appreciate it.
No worries at all. Thanks.